Hello, and a very warm welcome to you. Before we dive into the material today, I really want to offer a genuine divine blessing for your day and for your entire week ahead. May you find clarity, peace, and purpose in whatever you're facing right now.
Thank you for that. And yes, welcome everyone.
We are jumping straight into our mission for this deep dive. We're doing an exploration of Matthew chapter 17, and we are bypassing the surface level reading entirely.
Right, exactly. We're digging much deeper today.
We are. We're using the rich footnotes, the historical context, and the theological insights extracted from two major scholarly works. That's the Holman Study Bible and the NAA.
The Nova Almeida Actualizada Study Bible, yeah.
Right, the NAA Study Bible. We're using both to really understand the mechanics of this text.
Precisely, because this isn't just a basic recap of an ancient document.
Yeah.
It's really about unpacking the first century Jewish context.
Yeah.
We're analyzing the original Greek linguistics and pulling out those profound scholarly aha moments that, well, they completely reframe the narrative for you.
They really do.
These are the kinds of insights that help you understand the historical and literary sophistication of the text, completely regardless of your personal background.
And the literary structure of the specific chapter, it's built entirely on these dramatic, jarring contrasts. I mean, we start with this glowing supernatural encounter on an isolated mountaintop, and then the narrative immediately drops us into a chaotic, dusty scene of demonic possession down in a valley.
It was quite the tonal shift.
It's massive. And from there, it pivots to a grim, detailed prediction of death and betrayal. And then it caps off with a highly unusual miracle involving a tax payment extracted from a fish's mouth.
It is a masterclass in narrative tension, honestly. The authors are deliberately juxtaposing the divine, cosmic reality of who the text claims Jesus is with the exceptionally broken, gritty, and frustrating earthly reality that he and his followers are navigating.
Okay, let's unpack this right from the opening scene. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up a high mountain by themselves. For a casual reader, it's easy to picture a pleasant, grassy hill somewhere in Galilee. But the geographical data points to a much more intense setting.
It does. The NAA translation notes provide some vital geographical context here that entirely changes the atmosphere of the scene.
Because for centuries, religious tradition pointed to Mount Tabor as the site of this event, right?
Right, Mount Tabor. But scholars note a couple of serious issues with Tabor. First, it's only about 19 kilometers from the Sea of Galilee. And historically, there was likely a Roman military installation right at its summit during this exact period.
Which doesn't exactly fit the description of them being alone.
Not at all. So many modern historians argue the text is actually pointing toward Mount Hermon. Hermon sits at a towering 2,794 meters above sea level.
Wow.
Yeah, it is a massive, snow-capped, extremely imposing peak.
Which means if they were ascending Mount Hermon, the physical isolation was absolute. The air is thinner, the temperature drops, and they are entirely cut off from civilization.
Exactly.
And it's in that extreme isolation that the text says Jesus underwent a metamorphosis. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light.
That's a crucial word right there.
Yeah. The Holman study notes focus heavily on the original Greek word used here, which is metamorpho. It's where we get the English word metamorphosis.
And the linguistic distinction there is so critical for us. Metamorpho indicates a change on the outside that actually comes from the inside.
Right.
The commentary highlights that this wasn't an external light shining down on Jesus like a theatrical spotlight.
Like he's standing under a street lamp.
Yeah, exactly, no. It was an internal, intrinsic spiritual reality radiating outward. It was fundamentally altering his physical appearance.
What's fascinating here is how the scholars link this directly to the Old Testament imagery.
Oh, absolutely. What's fascinating here is the specific connection to the book of Exodus. When you read Exodus 34, Moses goes up Mount Sinai, encounters God, and his face shines so brightly, he actually has to wear a veil to keep from terrifying the Israelites.
But the study notes draw a sharp, intentional contrast between Moses and Jesus in this moment, don't they?
They do.
Yeah.
Moses was reflecting the glory of God, much like the moon reflects the sun. Because it was merely a reflection, it was temporary and fading, hence the need for the veil.
But the narrative here presents Jesus' brilliance as unveiled and intrinsic.
Precisely. He isn't reflecting glory, he is generating it. The text is establishing him as the new Moses, but one whose authority and nature vastly supersede the original.
That makes the next detail even more striking, because the original Moses actually makes an appearance.
Out of nowhere.
Suddenly, Moses and Elijah materialize, and they are conversing with Jesus. Since we know from basic biblical history that Moses and Elijah are the heavyweight representatives of the law and the prophets, their presence is symbolically massive. But the commentaries suggest another layer to why these two specific figures are present on this mountain.
Yes, look at their specific historical resumes. Both Moses and Elijah had their own defining, dramatic encounters with the divine on a mountain, specifically Mount Sinai, which is also known as Horeb.
Right.
And both had highly unusual departures from the earth. The text is using their presence to signal that the entire history of Israel's divine revelation is culminating right here in this one conversation.
Which brings us to Peter's reaction. He witnesses this cosmic convergence, and his immediate response is to offer to build 3 tabernacles, or tents.
Which is such a Peter move.
It really is. It seems like a bizarre, clumsy interruption. But the historical context suggests Peter wasn't just babbling about camping equipment.
No, he was likely making a deep theological connection, albeit a misguided one. The scholars note that Peter is probably referencing the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot.
Okay, unpack that for us.
Sure. In Jewish tradition, this feast wasn't just a historical remembrance of wandering in the wilderness. It had a strong eschatological element. It was heavily associated with the arrival of the Messianic age.
So Peter sees Moses, Elijah, and a glorified Jesus, and he essentially thinks, the end of the age is here, let's set up the permanent dwellings.
That's exactly his thought process. Let's lock this in.
But the narrative doesn't let him finish the thought. The NAA notes highlight the interruption. A bright cloud overshadows them.
And in the ancient Near Eastern context, and specifically in Jewish literature, a bright cloud is the Shekinah, the unmistakable, tangible manifestation of God's presence.
You see it leading the Israelites in Exodus and filling Solomon's temple in 1 Kings.
Yes, and out of this cloud a voice thunders, affirming Jesus as the beloved Son and commanding the disciples to listen to him.
That command is really the theological climax of the scene. By saying, listen to him while Moses and Elijah are standing right there, the text is asserting that the ultimate authority has shifted.
The law and the prophets are officially superseded by the Son.
And it absolutely terrifies the disciples. They drop face down to the ground. Then, as the vision fades and they begin the long hike down this massive mountain, they are left grappling with the theological implications.
They're trying to process everything they just saw.
So they ask Jesus a highly technical question based on their scribal teachings. They ask, why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?
They are trying to reconcile what they just witnessed with the prophecy in Malachi. That prophecy stated that Elijah would return to restore all things before the great day of the Lord.
Because they just saw Elijah, but then he vanished.
Right. And the commentary explains Jesus' response. He tells them Elijah already came, referring to John the Baptist. Now, the text isn't claiming reincarnation here.
No, not at all.
Rather, John operated in the prophetic spirit, power, and function of Elijah. And the notes point out a darker parallel Jesus makes here.
What's that?
Both John and Elijah face severe persecution. This serves as a direct literary foreshadowing of the suffering the Son of Man is about to face.
And that ominous foreshadowing leads right into the transition. The gospel writer takes the reader straight from the pristine, glorious theology of the mountaintop and violently drops them into the chaotic, dusty reality of the valley.
The contrast is jarring.
A desperate father pushes through a crowd, falls to his knees, and begs for his son's life.
The structural whiplash is entirely the point here. The narrative demands that the audience reconcile the divine authority established on the mountain with the overwhelming human suffering and spiritual impotence present in the valley.
The father describes his son's condition, stating that he is a lunatic. That's a term rooted in the ancient belief of being moonstruck. And he says that he suffers from severe convulsions, frequently falling into fires and water.
From a modern perspective, the symptoms align very closely with severe epilepsy.
Yes, and the Holman study notes provide a highly nuanced analysis of how the text handles this medical and spiritual diagnosis.
It's a crucial detail for modern readers to grasp. The notes clarify that the biblical authors and the culture at large actually did distinguish between regular physical ailments like epilepsy and demonic possession.
They didn't just universally attribute every illness to a demon.
Exactly.
No.
However, in this specific text, the narrative identifies that these severe epileptic-like symptoms were the direct physical manifestation of a destructive spiritual force attempting to kill the boy.
The tragedy of the scene is really compounded by the fact that the father already tried to get help from the disciples who had stayed behind.
And they completely failed to cure him.
And Jesus' reaction to their failure isn't a mild correction. He issues a blistering rebuke. He says, "Oh, faithless and perverse generation, how long am I to be with you?"
The phrasing there is deliberately provocative.
It is.
The Holman notes emphasize that Jesus is applying the exact same harsh terminology to his own followers and the surrounding crowd that he typically reserves for the deeply corrupt religious establishment that opposed him. He is diagnosing a systemic, fundamental lack of trust.
This raises an important question. Actually, wait, no, the disciples ask him that in private, don't they?
They do. This raises an important question. They ask him, why couldn't we cast it out?
Yeah.
Because they had been given authority to do this previously.
Right. Jesus is blunt, pointing to their little faith. And then he uses one of the most famous metaphors in historical literature. He says, if they have faith the size of a mustard seed, they could tell a mountain to move from here to there, and it would move.
For centuries, readers have wrestled with that imagery. They wonder if it requires some literal supernatural manipulation of tectonic plates.
Moving actual dirt and rock.
Right. But the Andalio notes completely dismantle that literalist reading by providing the cultural context.
What's the context there?
In first-century rabbinic literature, moving a mountain was a very standard, recognized idiom. A brilliant scholar who could solve incredibly complex legal or theological problems was often called a mountain uprooter.
So Jesus wasn't commanding them to rearrange the topography of the region.
Not at all. He was utilizing a familiar cultural idiom.
The commentary suggests the text is communicating that a tiny, genuine amount of properly placed faith is sufficient to overcome the most deeply entrenched, seemingly impossible spiritual obstacle.
Exactly. It isn't about the volume of faith. I mean, a mustard seed is minuscule. It's about the object and the authenticity of that faith.
Now, for the listener who loves the mechanics of how these ancient documents were preserved and translated, the Holman notes highlight a fascinating text-critical issue right at this spot in the narrative.
Oh, this is a great detail.
If you read older English translations, right after the mountain-moving comment, there is a verse 21 that reads, "But this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting."
The infamous missing verse. Because if you look at most modern translations, it skips right from verse 20 to verse 22.
And the scholars behind the Holman translation explain exactly why. Verse 21 is entirely absent from the oldest, most reliable Greek manuscripts of the Gospel of Matthew.
So how did it get in the older English versions?
Well, the consensus among textual critics is that early scribes, who were manually copying these manuscripts over centuries, were intimately familiar with the Gospel of Mark.
And Mark's version of this exact story does include a line about prayer.
Exactly. Because the scribes often had these parallel texts memorized, they unintentionally, or perhaps intentionally, harmonized the accounts. They inserted Mark's detail into Matthew's gospel so they would match perfectly.
It is a brilliant window into the rigorous science of textual criticism. Modern study Bibles pull these later editions out to get the reader as close to the original author's exact manuscript as possible. It demonstrates the high level of transparency in modern biblical scholarship.
As the narrative progresses, that shadow of suffering we mentioned earlier returns. Jesus gathers the disciples in Galilee and delivers his second explicit prediction of his death and resurrection.
But the NWA translation notes highlight a subtle, incredibly dark shift in the vocabulary he uses this time.
The Greek verb used here is paradidomi.
Right, which the notes explain means to be delivered or handed over. Jesus isn't just saying he will be arrested by the authorities, he is introducing the concept of betrayal.
He will be handed over into the hands of men by someone close to him.
Yes, the text notes that this specific realization causes the disciples to be deeply grieved.
It is a profound, heavy realization, but the author doesn't let the reader linger in the grief. Here's where it gets really interesting. The text immediately pivots from the cosmic weight of impending betrayal to the mundane, bureaucratic reality of paying taxes.
It's such a grounded human moment.
They arrive in the town of Capernaum, and Peter is approached by tax collectors, asking if his teacher pays the 2 drachmas.
To understand the tension in this scene, we have to look at the socioeconomic data provided in the footnotes. Referencing Exodus 30:13, the notes explain that this didrachma was not a Roman civil tax.
It wasn't going to Caesar.
No, it was a Jewish religious census tax. It was equivalent to about 2 full days' wages for a laborer, required annually from every Jewish male over 20. The funds were exclusively used to maintain the massive temple complex in Jerusalem and finance the daily sacrifices.
Peter, likely acting on reflex to protect his teacher's reputation, immediately says, yes, he pays it.
Typical Peter.
But when he goes back into the house, Jesus preempts him. He doesn't yell at Peter. Instead, he uses a brilliant Socratic method. He asks a logic puzzle.
He asks, from whom do the kings of the earth collect customs or taxes? From their sons or from strangers?
And Peter gives the obvious answer, from strangers.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the whole chapter, the theological architecture here is stunning. The temple in Jerusalem is defined historically and scripturally as the house of God the Father.
And on the mountaintop at the beginning of the chapter, God explicitly declared Jesus to be his son.
Exactly. Therefore, Jesus is the royal son of the house. And as the logic puzzle dictates, kings do not tax their own children to fund their own estates.
The commentary emphasizes that Jesus is declaring himself fundamentally, legally, and spiritually exempt from this religious tax.
And by extension, his followers, the new family of the king, are also exempt. The theological claim is one of absolute freedom from the old religious infrastructure.
But the narrative takes a surprising turn here. Jesus says, but so that we may not cause offense, or literally so we don't scandalize them, he decides to pay it anyway.
He has every right to refuse, but he chooses to forego that right.
And the method he uses to pay it is one of the most unique miracles in the text.
It is a highly specific, localized demonstration of power.
Jesus tells Peter, who we must remember is a professional fisherman who knows the Sea of Galilee intimately, to go to the lake, cast in a single hook, not a net, and open the mouth of the very first fish he catches.
Just a single hook.
Jesus says he will find a stater in its mouth, which he is to use to pay the tax for both of them.
The numismatic history here, the study of the currency, is fascinating. The Holman notes confirm that a stater, or a tetradrach, was a Greek coin valued at exactly 4 drachmas.
That is precisely the exact denomination required to pay the 2 drachma tax for 2 adult males.
The statistical impossibility of this event is what the commentary focuses on. It isn't presented merely as a magic trick to avoid dipping into their funds.
No. The notes argue that this specific miracle is a direct literary callback to the mountaintop.
It demonstrates Jesus' absolute, sovereign omniscience and his total authority over the natural world. He knows the exact fish, the exact location, the exact coin it swallowed, and the exact moment Peter will pass his line.
It creates a perfect narrative bookend. The chapter begins with a declaration of his cosmic, divine identity on the mountain and ends with a practical, earthly demonstration of that exact same divine dominion over nature.
Used to solve a completely mundane human problem.
So, what does this all mean when we synthesize this deep dive for you? By utilizing these scholarly sources, we see a chapter that does so much more than recount disconnected events.
We track the metamorpho, the internal intrinsic glory that established Jesus as vastly superior to the Old Testament figures of Moses and Elijah.
We navigated the historical nuance of how the ancients viewed physical and spiritual affliction in the valley.
And we unpacked the rabbinic idiom of moving mountains to understand the true nature of faith.
We also got a look behind the curtain of textual transmission with the missing verse 21, showing how human the process of preserving these texts could be.
And finally, we saw how the author used a staggering display of omniscience over a fish and a coin to cement the theological claim of Jesus' identity as the exempt son of the king.
It perfectly illustrates why engaging with the historical context and the original languages, like we did today with the Holman and NAA Study Bibles, is so vital. It transforms a flat reading into a three-dimensional historical and theological landscape.
I'd like to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, drawn from that last scene in Capernaum. The text presents Jesus as having the absolute, undeniable right to be exempt from the temple tax. The system was arguably corrupt, and he was the royal son.
Right.
Yet the narrative highlights his deliberate choice to lay down his rights, to pay the tax anyway, simply to avoid causing unnecessary offense and stumbling blocks for others. In our modern context, where asserting our rights, our exemptions, and our desire to prove we are correct is so highly prioritized, consider this. What does it look like in your own life to possess the ultimate right to something, but deliberately choose grace and humility instead?
That is a profound tension to navigate. The right to be right versus the choice to be gracious. Thank you for walking through this incredibly dense and rewarding text with us. We hope this exploration of Matthew 17 has equipped you with new tools and insights for your own reading.
It's been a great discussion.
As we bring this deep dive to a close, we want to formally leave you with this. God blesses all the listeners. Take care, and we look forward to having you with us on the next deep dive.